Hello and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with Nurole, the business-oriented podcast that brings the boardroom to your channel of choice. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Nurole, the board-level hiring platform that specializes in the high-value chair, independent director, advisory board member, and trustee placements that drive high-impact boards. Today, I'm delighted to be speaking with Bushra Ahmed. Having taken on her first role in the voluntary sector as a school governor, she currently serves as a trustee at a number of highly influential charitable organisations, including the Lloyds Bank Foundation for England and Wales, the Sheila McKechnie Foundation, and Homestart UK. Beyond these, she's been a trustee of a staggering mix of boards, including those for hyperlocal neighbourhood charities, regional advisory boards, as well as big nationals and frontline charities. Bushra, a huge welcome to the show.
Thank you, Oliver, and that was a really generous introduction, and I'm really delighted to be here.
Bushra, I'd like to start with your journey into the boardroom, and I'm always interested to see what the golden threads were that got you there.
I was born in the UK, and my parents came over in the late 1950s, and we settled in London, and we had the usual problems. We didn't have a lot of money, and my mum and dad, they didn't know very many people, but wherever I was in a family of 8. So we grew up in a kind of family that was very curious. So we were always hungry for knowledge. We just wanted to read and read and read because my dad loved reading. So he used to bring books into the house. He used to bring the Times newspaper in every day. And we were all very social. I was a particular natural networker. I loved having conversations. In fact, so much so that my school report when I was like 10 said that. She wrote it down. She could do better if she talked less. But it's a skill, for some people. And so as I was growing up, I was also kind of very involved in the social networks at school as well. So not just sticking to one group, but being that kind of person who would go into all of the different groups that you had at school, and we would talk about politics, or there was a musical group, or there would be different groups. And I was that one person that would be able to go into any of those groups and have those conversations because, again, like I said, I was curious. At that time, the BBC were doing a lot of stuff around Russia. I don't know why, but they had these Russian programs, and I loved learning those languages. And actually, I wanted to go to university and study Russian. But before I could go to my interview, my mother became very ill, so I stepped up to be a carer for her. So I didn't get to go to university. I was a young carer, full-time, and running the household with my younger siblings for 2 years while she was very ill, and then after that, still for another few years while she was getting better. And kind of that gives you a huge amount of responsibility. It puts you in a space where you become somebody that people start to rely on. I was always the one in the family that people would ask for advice. In fact, I was a coach, but I didn't realize it until much, much later. I was that kind of coach in the family. When I got married, I went and lived in Germany for a year, but then I came back and went into running a small business. So we had a laundrette and dry cleaners that my father had bought. And those kind of businesses at the time were they were the community hubs of the area. So everybody would come in. So being there for 15 years, day in, day out, 7 days a week, huge responsibility, never any time off. But, you get to know your local community. So literally everybody would come in. And they were information exchanges at the time when we didn't have any tech. So, where would you go to find out what was going on? Where would you go to find out? One of the most interesting things that happened to me was there was a family that used to come in and her daughter didn't know anything about the 11 plus. But because we'd as a family gone through that, I was able to say that to her. She got her eldest daughter, to go do the 11 plus. And then her daughter was the first to go to university. So they were those kind of spaces that everybody would just come together and learn things. And, I really enjoyed it. It was quite boring at times when you're in a laundrette. It was a family business, and literally we went through some very, very hard times with that. So the skills that you learn when you're running a business during a recession, when you have to count every penny, when you're managing staff, when you're trying to stop yourself from going bankrupt. We bought a second business, but we did lose that during the 1990s. And then we lost our home as well. And then we kind of brought it back a little bit, but it never really recovered from that recession. When I left the business in 2004, I was kind of a bit lost. I didn't know what I wanted to do or what my skills were because I didn't see those as skills. I do now looking back. But at the time, I was like, I've just run a family business. There's no value in that. I'd done some work in my community around empowering women. I'd done some fundraising, in fact, quite a lot of fundraising. But I didn't see the value in that because when charities were coming in and engaging with us as a faith community, they didn't see the value in what I was doing. So, of course, I didn't. So I kind of took on a few different things. One of those was directorship of my faith community charity, and I raised £250,000 through regional community fundraising, through women, just doing small things in their local areas. But of course, when I look back now, I was auditing all of that money and doing the finance. And so when I say I have no finance skills, I'm like, but you actually do. But I just didn't recognize it. Again, looking back now, I see those as skills, but I didn't at that time. I was also doing school tours for my mosque, which is the largest mosque in Western Europe. And so 3,000 or 4,000 people, visitor groups, children and adults would come in every year, and I would take them around. And one of the things that I started to do was develop a time where they could just be in a space in a mosque. This is the time, remember, after 9/11, after 7/7, and all of those conversations around Muslims, especially Muslim women, and we would allow them to just ask any questions. So it was about breaking down those cultural barriers. It was around being able to say to a Muslim woman, well, why do you wear black, for example? Because that's a big fear for people. And I'd say, because it's slimming. Why do you have a little black dress? So, it's, and what are arranged marriages apart from, you go to eHarmony and we kind of use a different system. It's about breaking it down with my understanding and background, because I was born and brought up here, to be able to have those conversations. And we had some really, really breakthrough moments during those tours. And it also developed my ability to speak to a class of 5-year-olds and pitch to them, and to a class of 70, just a group of 70-year-old visitors from a charity or something, and pitch to them. And that's a really difficult skill. So I think that those are the kind of things I was taking on. But of course, in 2011, when the riots happened, that's when my life changed completely. So whereas I'd been doing things internally within a safe space in my faith community, I was then thrown into this world of council, police, local charities, and the golden threads that you talk about. All of the things that I'd learned up till then came into play, because it was the resilience of being brought up by my parents who had to have that resilience. It was the hard times and the grit and their lived experience that I'd learned from that came into play. So I was able to hold my own in rooms where, people didn't even want to see me. They saw me come into the room, but they didn't see that they would actually look right through me at some point. So, and they didn't really want to support much that I was doing. It was really hard to get that compensation, because there were 9 flats and 40 shops that had been burnt down. And I was running around everywhere expecting people to help who said they would, but then they didn't. So, you think you're saying you want to help, but why don't you? But then, so I had to step up and do it myself. So I was just making those connections, talking to everybody, not worrying about what level I was at. I didn't care if it was, a prime minister or a mayor. I had every right to go and speak to them because something had happened. They needed to help us. I met royalty, I met the mayor, I met, the leader of the opposition. I met all of these people, and I was able to have that conversation because they were so far remote from what was happening. I wanted to sit down and tell them face to face, this is what's happened to us, and you need to take notice of us and help us. And of course, when we see Grenfell, you see that people were similarly let down. So we don't really learn the lessons. So I kind of used my expertise from all of the things that I'd learned, the campaigning, the networking, all of that. What was I going to do? And when I did finally get the compensation, which I did, I got over £9 million to rebuild those shops and flats. And everybody said to me, become a politician. Oh, you speak really well. Become a councillor. We need people like you. And I thought, as soon as I become a councillor, you're going to tell me what to say, what I can't say. And I don't really want to do that anymore. And I didn't want to be tied down, because I'd run a shop for 15, 20 years, and you have to be there 24/7. And I didn't want to be tied down anymore. I wanted to explore. I was 50 at the time, and I hadn't really felt that I'd done anything in my life, and I wanted to explore what I could do with the skills that I was discovering. Where was I going to go? I didn't know, but there was a path, and I was just blindly following it to see where it would lead me. So I didn't really want to go anywhere. But then somebody said to me, become a trustee. And nobody had ever said that to me. And then I realized it was because it was such a status symbol that, people didn't ask you to become trustees. They didn't ask people like me to become trustees. So, yes, that's where I realized that actually in all of the conversations we'd been having through the community and strategy and kind of all of those conversations with the police and local people, that the charity sector was really quite influential and had quite a lot of power. And I thought that's where I need to be. So, of course, that's where, it kind of took me for my first role.
Gosh, what an amazing story. You talked there about people not getting it, who haven't come through that lived experience. And now, obviously, you're sitting on that other side of the table. What have you learned? Or what's your perspective now, I suppose? Do you see things different? I remember before I took on any board roles, I used to get quite frustrated with the boards that I reported to and think, gosh, why can they not see this? This is so obvious. And then I sat on the other side of that table and oh my gosh, how on earth am I supposed to make any decisions here? Like, I haven't got half the information I need. And just found that shift in perspective actually quite enlightening to how difficult some of those roles are. And I sometimes hear a lot of people in society today, castigating those in positions of power. And I sometimes feel like they don't necessarily give enough credit for how difficult those positions can sometimes be. But what's been your experience of that? And how do you bring the experiences you've had to bear into your board roles?
When you do get there and, you realize what the board is, what its purpose is, the decisions they have to make, you have to make decisions about finances, who you're going to support, who you're not going to. But also for small charities, they're firefighting all the time, looking for money, trying to find the right funding or the next funding. So it's really difficult to be on a board. And I do understand now that I'm there, why maybe people are wary of opening up their boards to people from outside, because if you get the wrong person on a board, then it can upset the dynamics. And then you spend your whole time just kind of dealing with the drama of people's that they bring to the boardroom, which happens a lot in smaller charities, especially at local level, a bit like the Jackie Weaver type of scenario, if you know what I mean, that kind of ego-led, founder-driven. You enter the boardroom you enter a charity thinking, oh, this is great, I'll bring my skills and I can do all of this and this charity will grow and will be better. But actually, the thing is that you suddenly realize that actually some of the trustees would rather keep their power in a smaller way than actually open up and allow others to have that power. So I think in cases like that, it can be really difficult to make a mark, because when you're constantly having that back and forth, then I think then you realize that it's probably not worth your time to stay. And at some points, I've made that decision to kind of not stay. Yeah, but my perspective on the boards, I do have some sympathy, but I also think that there's a real reckoning to be had around the board table with the statistics that we have about who are still board members. And for me, I see that there's two sectors, the charity sector and the corporate sector. There's a lot of crossover. So whatever issues that we have in the charity sector, you probably have the same issues in the corporate sector because they're the same people, or the academic sector. And all of those are intersecting between each other, whether it's in education or university boards or whatever it is. And so I think, there are real changes that need to be made to now fix those things in terms of you need to open up your boards and you need to diversify and you need to include people, not because people are telling you that it's the right thing to do, but because it will benefit the people that you are serving. Because, for an example, if you have a disability charity that has not one disabled person on the board, I do not see how that charity can be effective. Because when you're making those strategic decisions, when you're setting out your vision, you don't have that voice in the room. And it can be really difficult. And sometimes the staff are there trying to do the right thing. And they're frustrated because the board just don't get it. And well, yes, I think sometimes when people are talking about the people that they're serving, so grantees, for example, there's sometimes a lack of understanding about various ways that charities operate. So a lot of funders will only fund, charities rather than CICs. But of course, a lot of BME and Black and Asian minority ethnic groups, they set up CICs because it's more convenient for them. And also they need to be paid for what they do. And that's just the way of life. So if you're a young mother who's lost a child and you want to start a charity or want to, start something, to set up a charity it takes a lot of time. You have to have a lot of money before you even start that journey. Well, a lot of people don't have that, but they just want to get on and do stuff. So they'll set up a CIC, and then that means they can't get any funding. So I think just being able to bring that perspective into some of the groups or organizations or boards that I've been on is, it opens some of their eyes, because sometimes they're just very scared of that risk. There's a risk around things. And so sometimes it's like, They just don't do things because they're too risky, because they don't understand that that's how communities work. And if you want to fund something effectively, you can fund and make more impact if you delve a bit deeper. So, where you have the people at the top, which is the voluntary sector and, all of those infrastructure organizations, it's very easy to go to them. But then sometimes it's the people underneath, like underneath the soil, as my friend Aisha always says, that are doing the work, and they don't get you need to feed those and you need to fuel that. And so it's just about being in that room and talking about your lived experience and talking about how something made you feel, growing up or just being ignored. Or sometimes, there's an example that a friend of mine went into a board. She's one of two women of color, and she was responsible for recruiting the CEO. And, having gone through the recruitment process with this person and then having had 2 or 3 meetings about diversity with this person, he then writes a report that gets her name wrong and puts the wrong person in. And so around the board table, when she brings it up, it's laughed off because it's just seen as a mistake. But of course, for somebody, it's like, I don't belong here now. What am I doing here? There's such a level of frustration then, and you're not going to get what you need to out of that person with all their skills.
Can you give me an example of where you've gone into a boardroom and you felt that you've been able to bring that different perspective that the board wouldn't otherwise have got?
I think that the board being part of that discussion, you can't get that from your advisory boards or from whatever else, because sometimes that message doesn't even come up to the people who are in the boardroom. And I know that because many times, like during COVID, there were boards set up, advisory boards set up, and they would come in and the first thing they would say to all of us who were there is, yes, you're taking part, but there's no guarantee that what you're saying will reach the board. So I would be like, well, what's the point then? What are we doing here? And so to have somebody at the board, and again, there was, I was taking part in something for a club that was like an equalities thing. Have we frozen? So I was taking part in a club that, in an equalities thing for a football club. And they started this program and then they didn't give it any time because the board was not invested in it. And so when they came back to us a year later and said, we want to start it up again, I said, well, I'm only going to come back and take part in this if I can go into the boardroom and ask them for myself, are you invested in this? Do you really want this change? Because if not, what are we doing here? And I think they weren't ready for that. So then that said to me, you're not ready for change. And, I need to take my time somewhere else.
Got it. And sometimes I'll hear people say, there's a difference between what you require in the board versus things that you can pull into the boardroom, whether it's through consultants or committees, subcommittees, or interest or focus groups and the like. How do you think about that difference of, why it's important to have that diversity of perspective at the boardroom itself, as opposed to being pulled into the boardroom through other channels?
Well, firstly, I don't have a university degree. I don't have the academic background. I don't have a professional career that I can put on my CV. So often when I'm going for the roles, that's an automatically, right, you're just discounted straight away. The board roles that come up, they want legal, they want corporate, they want finance, they want digital. If I said I was, I know about finance, they'd say, but no, you don't, because there's nothing in your background that says you have a financial qualification. Does it mean that you don't know about finance? I don't think so. But digital, I know I'm very technical, but that doesn't translate because I don't have anything on my CV that says that I know about it. So what's missing sometimes is there's a need for every company and every charity serves people. And yet there's a lack of people and place and community and cultural intelligence skills in that job role description. If you don't have somebody like that on your board, then it's really difficult, I think, for you to understand exactly who you're serving. And I think that's the missing link in many, many boards. That's why I think, cultural intelligence is kind of starting to be quite a big thing where people are being coached in it. But actually, you can coach the chair in it, but isn't it better to have that resource at the boardroom through a lived experience person or somebody who's actually, come through that journey and can give their experience, but also with the experience of governance and everything else that you need for a board role.
Brilliant. Very powerful. And before we talk more about the board experience, I'd love to dive into some of what you touched on there around the recruitment process. And you've previously described yourself as a non-traditional trusteeship candidate. I'd love to hear your experiences of the recruitment process.
Well, actually, I haven't been part of that process for the roles that I'm at now. I was part of the process for the Small Cities Coalition when we were looking for a CEO. And I think, we were looking for, actually, that was quite a different process because I was new and I kind of learned since then. But I am now joining a nominations committee. So I think I will be able to bring my skills and my experience to that role. But I haven't actually done a lot of that yet.
Brilliant. And when your boards are looking for candidates now with that sort of cultural intelligence, and you're trying to pick from, 100 different profiles, what is it that you're looking for to figure out who are the handful that you're going to spend the time interviewing and really focusing your time on? Or how do you sort of make that selection?
I would say that when you are preparing the role that you want to hire for, that you need to make people feel welcome in that role. So if you want somebody with those skills, then put it into the job description, put it into the role, put community engagement, put people, place, community, put those kind of, value those skills in the actual role so that the people, if I was looking at a board role that I was going for and it didn't have that in there, I probably wouldn't apply. So because it's not welcoming to me and I don't want to be rejected straight away because I don't have the specific set of skills that are, the recognized ones. And I think that's where the gap is sometimes in recruitment, where people like me wouldn't even apply. So you don't have to filter us out because we're just not there.
Okay. But if you were talking to a chair let's say a chair listening to this podcast and said, Bushra, I heard you on the podcast. I love what you said. I need to find someone like you for my board. How do I pick that out? When I'm sort of scanning through, 100 profiles, is there a way that people can do that other than meeting you in person and having a conversation, but that doesn't allow you, you've got a finite amount of time as a nominations committee or a chair or whatever?
Well, a lot of local charities look for people who they want on their board, but they will not take into account that somebody knows the local area will be more valuable than somebody from outside the local area because you know the people, the place, especially for NHS trusts and those kind of boards. I think it's really important. And although they do kind of sometimes say people, place and community in NHS board roles, when you get there, that's not really what they're looking for, because then it just doesn't work out. So I think there has to be a real sea change in recruiters, in the way that boards are. I think the Charity Commission can do a lot to help that in just, making a few tweaks as to, who trustees are and what they do and their time span, the refreshing of the board. All of that comes into play. So you're making room for people. You're making room for people at the board who can then bring a new experience, a new vision, a new, young people, for example, bring them onto the board. There are some very, very capable young people that I know who are on boards and they are brilliant. But of course, when I was going for a board role, I thought to myself, this is too hard. Before my first one, I was like, this is too hard. I won't be able to read the papers. I won't be able to understand them. I haven't done anything since school. But actually, it was not that hard. And I was able to read the papers. And in fact, I was reading the papers where some other people didn't bother. So, it's about your commitment. If you commit to something and you can read papers, you can understand a budget, even without that kind of academic background.
You were originally persuaded to become a school governor, which is how you first got into the voluntary sector in roles outside your faith community. Why did you need persuading? And if there's a sort of, Bushra Mark II out there listening now, what do you know now that you would wish they could know now? And would you still need persuading?
So I was persuaded because I had to be persuaded because first it was a school governor role and my children were growing up. And I thought, what is my role in this board? What can I offer? But of course, the school that I was going to be governor for was an academy that was coming into the area and they had no idea of the place or the people or anything. And they needed to build those links. So my fabulous mentor, Tony Letts, she persuaded me to kind of join the board and link that budding school with the mosque opposite, which was my mosque, and introduced them into the community. And having done that as a founding governor, and then when I first started there, I went into my first board meeting and everybody was, they'd been on 5 other boards. They were all in the same education, academic sector, and they were all acronyms. And of course, I didn't know what that meant. So as my head at the time would tell you, Bushra is the one who came in and said, well, what does that mean? And so they had to stop and think. And it really made them stop and think about the way that they ran the board and the way that they just assumed that everybody would know these things. And when I went back, when I went for my last meeting and we met the new person coming in as a parent governor, the head teacher said, this is the way we do things differently, because when Bushra came in, we realized that we were speaking a completely different language and we had to kind of change things to make sure that everybody was included. So what I would say to people now is I would get involved in becoming a school governor, because it's a really valuable thing that you can do in your community if you have the time to give, which I know is very difficult. And if I knew now now that I know what the whole thing is like, I think I would have joined maybe earlier. Maybe when my children were at school, I maybe would have taken that step then, if that had been a more welcoming place for people like me.
I hear that a lot from people who sort of say, I'm too young to take on a board role, or I'm too busy to take on a board role. And my personal experience of it has always been incredibly enriching to my day job. And although sometimes I feel like I haven't got time to do it, you always somehow find the time, and actually it makes you better at what you do, as well as being, enriching and refreshing to have that range of activity to participate in. I want to move on to talk a bit about your sort of experiences on boards. You've been on quite a wide range of sort of local, London-wide, national charities. Have there been much differences between those experiences?
I think it depends on the size of the charity rather than where it is at local and national level, because, for example, Age UK Croydon was quite a big charity in terms of, its budget, in terms of income, in terms of staff, whereas Small Charities Coalition was a very small charity with, a number of staff and, a smaller budget. So I don't think it's so much where it's placed, but whether it's an infrastructure charity or whether it's a delivery charity. And so whether it's part of a wider network. So Age UK Croydon obviously had a wider network that they could tap into, which was useful for them. And Small Charities Coalition was an infrastructure charity that was dealing with a network. So, it just depends on the charity. Every charity has its own issues around sustaining itself, keeping going. Then most of my experience was during COVID with some of the charities that I've been on. And that was very, very hard for them, because, how do you keep going when you're not able to deliver? Yeah, I don't think the differences aren't that great. So that's basically what I'm trying to say. Depends whether you're a larger charity or a smaller charity and where your funding is coming from. But otherwise, they all have the same kind of issues.
And what about being a trustee of a grant-making foundation, the Lloyds Banking Foundation for England and Wales? Is that a very different role?
Yes, so this is a very different role. Apart from the fact that I feel that they recruited in a different way. So when I was going through the recruitment process for Lloyds, I had previously been through a recruitment for a funder where I felt very much rejected, because they told me I was too different for their board and I was a step too far. And I think if you read the Charity Times profile piece that I did, I kind of document how that went in there. But, for this process, it was more about, are you, not why are you joining our board? Why do you want to join our board? But who are you? Tell us about yourself. So just that in the process of before I got there, that was very different. And maybe they are more, maybe they're more relaxed because they're a funder and they know where their money's coming from. I don't know if that makes a difference. It was much more hands-on from the start. So when I joined, immediately, I was linked up with the charity trustee as a buddy, which really made me feel welcome. I had a conversation with the chair. I had a conversation with the CEO. And having a conversation with the chair, she was really amazing, because she gave me so much good advice. And she said to me, look, I know you've come in from this kind of community background, but don't limit yourself. be your whole self, bring your whole self to the board and take an interest in everything. So, for example, she was telling me that there was a charity trustee who'd been there before who didn't know about finance, but he joined the Finance and Audit Committee because he wanted to find out more. And for me, that was really valuable information because I think we tend to limit ourselves to what we know. And on a board, we're seen as these kind of people with this expertise and, you shouldn't really step out of that. But I think if you do bring your whole self to the board, then I'm able to bring some of the other skills that I have as well and feel confident about it. And then they immediately gave me some responsibilities. So I'm part of the local motion program, which is with 6 other funders. And I've just this week been on a trip to Lincoln to have a look at the people and the place and the project and what's going on. And I just feel that I'm being utilized in a very different way than I have been before, which I really like because I know what I can give. I can give my time, I can give my skills, I can bring my insights back to the board, and I think it will make a real difference.
Wow, she sounds like an amazing chair. You said she's given you lots of good advice. That was a brilliant piece. What are there other bits that you can share?
Well, she said to me, one of the things that inspired me actually was that she said she hadn't been to university either. And this was the outgoing chair. So we now have a new chair who's also amazing. And she's really very much in the same vein. They both were just really very much down to earth about, involving the trustees, making sure that we all know each other, making sure that we are inducted properly, making sure that the board papers are really well done in the way that, we don't spend our time reading papers during the board meeting, but we actually take the time to discuss the things that need to be discussed. So I think the beauty of a good chair is that when you come to a board meeting and you can have those discussions and have that time for that, where you can really delve into something that needs to be discussed rather than just, going through the minutes page by page, which I think sometimes in smaller charities that happens a lot. And you come out of a board meeting feeling, what have we actually achieved in this board meeting?
I love that. When have you seen the boards you've worked with add most value?
I think boards are there to kind of look at the strategy, look at the vision. And I think if you have people from very different areas, but we all feed off each other, then I think you're coming together and you're building like a really good vision, a strategy. All of you bring your knowledge and skills. Boards can add value by their networks. Obviously that's why a lot of people pick trustees from big corporates or whatever. But I think sometimes the mistake that people make is to see those people just as corporate people. And I remember being in a situation where one of the trustees, who is from a corporate, she was a bit frustrated because she said, I am a real person as well. I do have a background and I grew up quite poor because that wasn't, they weren't seeing her in that light. They were just seeing her for that corporate entity. And I think that's not the first time that I've come across that actually. Then I thought, I've seen that before in other boards where people are seen, it's kind of like a transactional thing. It's not like it's like, okay, you're from this corporate, so you're going to bring those networks and that's what you're there for. But it's not about the whole being. So I think boards add value when they set a good culture. If you can set the culture of the board to be such that, you invite staff in and, they're part of it, which I really think is necessary, the culture filters down. If you have an open and inclusive culture at the board level, then that will filter down into your senior management and your staff. And I think a lot of the issues that people have come from when, it's definitely top down, the culture, I think, in an organisation.
I have a hypothesis that a large number of boards underinvest in the psychological safety of the group around the board table and the board dynamics. And often you've got, people sitting on those boards, very busy people. And so they come in for the transaction effectively for the board meeting or any given set piece, and then they disappear off. Is that your experience? What have you seen people doing well or badly in that regard?
I think where a board member comes in, there's no interaction with the other board outside of that, apart from, maybe at the end of the meeting, people will say, well, let's go to the pub. That's fine. But, pub is very noisy. You don't get to meet other people. And it's not a comfortable environment for everybody. So some of us maybe wouldn't go. But, if there's, a real effort to make sure that the board members all bond together, they know each other, they're curious about each other. Who are you? Why are you here? So some boards that I've been on will go around and ask people to introduce themselves when there's new board members there. Because if that doesn't happen, I mean, I remember I joined a board and there was a young person who had joined the board and she'd been there a few months before me. So myself and the new member reached out to her and said, oh, you've been there, we'd love to get to know you and know about the board and everything. And she was like, you're the first people to reach out to me. I don't know anybody else. And so she was so unconfident that she was thinking of leaving because she felt she couldn't say anything. So by then us reaching out to her and being kind of like having those conversations and giving each other that confidence. But, if there hadn't been somebody like myself, for example, who felt that was necessary to kind of reach out. And I've often been that person where, you go onto the board and you don't know anybody, but nobody even asks you who you are or why you're there. I think that's a real shame. I think that's an opportunity missed for people to, like you say, have some board development, not necessarily strategy away days, but just like a board away day where you get to know each other, you know what each other's strengths are, what their skills are, you're curious about the people you're in a room with. I just don't understand why, if you're in a room with people, you wouldn't want to know who they are. It doesn't make sense to me. That kind of stifles any debate that you might have. It kind of stifles any productivity or any kind of innovation that might come out of, well, okay, if I know that you are like this, but also your background, then, I might feed off that.
Have you been into boardrooms where you felt that sense of belonging wasn't created? And how did you go about breaking that down? Or were there people in the boards who helped break that down?
Some of the charity boards I've been in have been like that. Some of them, when I was earlier on in my career, you don't have the confidence to talk about it or to face it. So you just stay silent most of the time. And I think a good chair will notice that. But if the chair doesn't notice that and doesn't bring you in, if you're not speaking, if you're not contributing, and the chair doesn't notice that, then I think what a lot of people do is they just leave quietly, make up some excuse and just leave. Because if you don't feel you're contributing, but you can't challenge, I think now definitely that's very much different. If I was now to be in a boardroom and that would happen, I would definitely challenge it because I would have the confidence to know that the difference it would make. And I'm much stronger in myself and I think because I was unconfident about people saying, well, you don't know what governance is and you don't know how boards are run and you don't know about any of that. Now I do. And I've got the confidence to say that. So I can chat. But fortunately, I haven't had to up till now. I'm very fortunate to be on some connected boards. And I like that, where we all kind of are very much connected. So, yeah, but I think if I came across it or if I was giving advice to anybody, I would say, if you're on a board and you don't feel that you belong or that people aren't making you feel included, have a word with the chair, raise it, talk to them about it, and have the confidence to do that.
What have been the most difficult decisions that you faced as a trustee, either individually or as part of the collective board?
Oh, I think sometimes it's about staffing, isn't it? When you have to take those decisions about letting people go in certain situations. And I think, again, during COVID, there were some really difficult decisions to be made. And, I found that difficult to do. But also when the board it hasn't got the culture that makes you feel included. I think there has been times when I've just kind of said, this is a bad situation and I'm just going to step away. And I made that decision. I stepped away because I feel that I don't want to be anywhere where I have to compromise my values, my honesty, my integrity. I don't want to be in that place, no matter what the cost. So if I am in a position and other young people are looking at me and, I'm mentoring them and I'm saying to them, you have to have this confidence, you have to stick to your values and your integrity, then I have to show that by example. And there have been times when I've had to do that.
Can you maybe talk about some of those examples without breaking any confidences of, sometimes it could be a fine line between where your responsibility as a board member is to push and help the organization get better versus when actually it's just, there's nothing I can do here. This is beyond hope or a repair or anything I can do. And actually I've got to step away from it to at least signal that. And as part of my responsibility, can you talk me through maybe a situation you faced and how you navigated that line?
So there was an organisation that I went into that was actually, when we got there, it was about to go under. And that was the very first conversation that as new trustees we had. So we kind of said, well, as new trustees, let's look at this again. Is the need still there? Do we still need this organisation? And so but there had been a lot of toxicity that had gone on and the culture was bad and it hadn't been addressed. So we were coming in, we didn't know any of that, but we said, look, let's just see what we can do with this. Look at your assets, see what they are, make the most of it. And it was a very positive thing. We tried to and we did, we carried on. And then after that, I think there came a time when the board was not invested properly. They weren't included. The chair was, when you have those boards where it's just the chair and the CEO and they're making all the decisions, that is not a good thing. And then everybody else felt not included, but then it wasn't a cohesive board. And at some point, I just had to say to myself, there were so many issues going on. I said to myself, I've done my best and it was making me ill. So I just left. And I made that decision, not having anywhere else to go to, being in quite a good position where that position for somebody like me was, attracting some attention. But I looked to myself and I thought, can I live with myself if I just, if I carry on, nobody's listening, change isn't happening, so I need to leave.
Got it. Now, I've spent quite a lot of time focusing on the challenges and the difficult aspects of being on a board. I want to make sure I'm not sort of putting anyone off. So I'd love to hear about some of your highlights of being a trustee. When have been the moments? Because I guess for most of these roles, they're pro bono, and that's something we haven't also talked about, is how you balance mix. You've got to keep yourself funded, and how do you navigate that when most a lot of these trustee roles are unpaid? But first, the highlights.
Yeah, there are highlights, and the reason I do this unpaid and pro bono is because I love doing it. I love being able to use the skills. And see, when I went through that riot journey, I learned so much through it, and I wanted to be able to use that knowledge and those skills somewhere, but I didn't know where. It wasn't a job. It wasn't, a position that I had in mind. But I think now being on these boards and with the funders and the grants and all of those, the grantees and their experiences, I can use all of that. So for me, that's a real highlight to do that, showing that even though I don't have the traditional background, I am able to bring my unique experience to the board. I inspire other people who look like me, but also young people, men, young men, young women who don't look like me, who are just inspired by the fact that I've got to where I've got to. There was one particular time when I was speaking at the GLA, and it was an event about community and something, and I was on a panel with two very professional women, and I felt so out of place because it was my first paid speaking role. Actually, I was just really scared because obviously that comes with responsibility. So I thought to myself, what do I do? Do I learn the language that these people are speaking and kind of come across as professional, or do I just be myself, because that's all I can be? So I decided to be myself. So I spoke. I did feel really like, I hadn't said anything important. And then when I came off the platform, there was about 200 people in the room. I came off the platform and I went across to the back to get a drink. And there was a man behind there who was serving the drinks. And he said to me, can you just hold on for a minute? And I said, yeah, happy to. And he said, my name's William, and I just want you to know that this is your first speaking engagement, but you will go on to have many more. And when you do, I want you to remember William, because what I'm about to say to you is that you really touched me with what you said, because you were real. And I was so taken aback by that. I thought, well, firstly, I didn't even know they were listening. And he said, you remind me of my grandmother, which, he was quite old. So I was like, okay, the wisdom that you possess and the fact that you just said what needed to be said without, kind of trying to coach it in different words. That was about three years ago, and I haven't forgotten that. And so whenever I do anything, I think to myself, I have to be me, because if I try and be somebody else, I can't keep it up. And it's got me to where I am. And so this is who I am. I will always speak in a way that people understand, not necessarily the people, in the room, but definitely the Williams.
I love that. And actually, that resonates with when I spoke with one of the people who sits on a board with you to get more insight into what you're like as a board member. They highlighted a couple of your superpowers. And one was that you have this ability to bring people in, no matter their sort of background, creed, color. How do you do that? If I want to learn how to do that, what advice can you give me? What's going through your head when you're doing that? Can you analyze it if it's just coming naturally to you? What is it that you think you do that enables you to have that superpower?
I think I just love talking to people, and I love building those networks. I love finding out about new people, new things. So if I'm in a room and I see somebody in a suit, I will just go up to them and introduce myself and have a conversation, not thinking that this person has nothing in common with me, but what does this person have in common with me? So I want to know. And, when I was going through the riot journey, I would have lots of conversations with people who are working in the sector, working in corporates, for example, who would say to me, look, I'm just a middle-aged white man. Nobody understands, but I really want to do something good for the community. And they would have those conversations with me, long conversations and I would say to them, look, don't limit yourself by saying that. If you want to do something good, there's lots of people out there who appreciate what you do. So I was building those connections with all sorts of different people and across the ages, across the sectors, across, from corporate to politics to, the civil sector to all sorts of people. And I kept up those relationships. And I think it's really important to keep up relationships so that when you're speaking to somebody, so for example, if you belong to a charity, people always think you want money. But I think it's really important to, first of all, build a relationship with somebody, find out who they are, and, just be interested in people. And if you do that, people see that is a genuine relationship. If down the line, then you need something, people are more inclined to help you because they understand that your intentions are good and that you're interested in them, not for what they can give you, but for who they are. And I think that's a really important thing to do because then when I ask somebody to do something, they do it. So I think I've got about 4 or 5 videos from different events where people have said, if Bushra asks you to do something, you just do it. And my local MP, the other local MP, and, people of influence, because they know that I'm not just trying to use them. They know I'm interested in who they are and what they do, who they are behind the title, if you like. I think that's really important. And also, you've said kind of about mental models. Firstly, I didn't know what that was, but when I looked it up, I think it's like, I read this somewhere. There's a man with a hammer and he's got a nail and that's it. But for me, I'm like, I've got this, the knife that has lots of different tools on it.
Yeah.
That's me with my toolkit. So I feel that I've got quite a few bows to my arrow, bows to my sling, if you like, different sectors that I can go into, exactly the same as I was when I was in the sixth form. I had different groups that I could go to and meet with and, support and help and get. Some of it is for support, some of it is for help, some of it is for mentoring. But, across the board, I've got quite a varied platform. I haven't just stuck to one thing. And I think that really, and also when you have a passion for what you do and what you believe in, and you can bring people with you because you really believe in it and you believe it's necessary. So, for example, with the terriers, and now I'm an ambassador for them, it's because having come through the riots and seeing how we were letting down young people and needing to do something in that space to prevent these things from happening again, that's where I kind of thought that we needed to really do something innovative.
That was the other thing they highlighted as one of your superpowers, your ability to just make things happen. And I think with the Terriers, you roped in the Mayor of London to support you with this. There's a group of young actors, for those not familiar with them, from Liverpool who'd been in gangs to talk about how they changed. And you just pulled in the Mayor of London, as one does. But also in some of the other examples you've talked about where, you've just forgot 9 million of funding or raised 250,000. You obviously have an extraordinary ability to really move mountains. What do you think it is that makes you able to do that in a way that there are lots of people, I see, who sit on boards who are really good about talking about things, but don't actually affect change? What do you think you do?
So firstly, I'm an optimist and I always see things, I remember what I had to make a business card and it was the saying that, you see things and you see why, and see things and I'm like, why not? So I always like to say, well, why don't we try something? And if it doesn't work out, what have we lost, really? So it's about being optimistic. And then I remember reading Pollyanna when I was young, and she was always glad about things. She always, even though it's a book about a young girl who becomes paralyzed, and before she becomes paralyzed, she's always been this girl who goes around helping people and sacrificing herself and doing things for others. She's only a young girl. It's a book probably before your time. But she was always glad about things. And then when she becomes paralyzed, people expected her not to be the same person, but she carried on in that same way, making others feel better in spite of the fact that she was in this situation. And I think that really affected me when I was young. And I've always had that in the back of my mind. Be glad about things or be glad about what you have rather than looking at what you don't have. So even when my shop was burning down and I was watching it burn down, in the back of my mind, I was thinking, honestly don't know what this is and why it's happening, but I'm sure there's a good reason for it, because otherwise I couldn't make sense of it. So I had to see it in that positive way. And when I was, another one of my mottos, as people will know, is paralyze resistance with persistence. So just keep going. I got the play to the Old Bailey, this play about gun and gang violence, because I'd been to lunch with the judges, and they have very little interaction with the outside world. So it was decided that people from the community would come in and have lunch with them, and I was invited to go there. And I brought up the terriers because at the time there was young people, 7 or 8 young people going through trials for murder. And actually, those people who are judging them don't really understand the situation that these young people find themselves in. So I wanted to bring the play there to raise the profile in the Old Bailey, which is kind of like the seat of the law and everything that happens, to say, look, it's a play developed by Royal Liverpool Court Theatre and the police and the council after Rhys Jones was killed about 11 years ago. And as we know, we've just had another shooting of a young girl in Liverpool. So it's a really relevant play that talks about prevention. It's about getting to young people before they get to that point where they're involved in gangs or guns or violence, and showing them a way out. So I think that was really important. And if anything's important to me, I will try and just, amplify it, raise it, support it in any way I can.
I love that. Thank you for sharing. The time has flown by, and it's now time to move into our wrap-up section. First up is the pass-along question, which is a question from a previous guest that I'll ask you, and then we'll go on to the 5-question quickfire if you're ready.
Yes, absolutely.
So the pass-along question is, how should boards decide the extent to which their organizations should have a voice on geopolitical, social change, religious issues that are not part of their core purpose?
That's a difficult one, because I think, if you're a charity, if you're a funder, if you're, looking at the situation now, I think obviously depending on, your values and mission and the core purpose, of course, but I do think that charity boards should have more of a voice. And I would like to see more charities speaking up for what's going on at the moment, because, I think they have a lot of power. I think there's a lot of power in that sector. We do contribute to policy. We do contribute to, government policy. They call charities in. They have quite a lot of influence. So, I'd like to see more of a voice. And I think there's a lot more now with letters being signed by hundreds of charities coming together to kind of raise those issues. And I think that's a good thing.
5-question quickfire. So I'm going to say a short statement and ask you for a short response if you're ready.
Yeah.
So the best book every board member should read, and why?
So for boards, firstly, I was going to say Matthew Syed and Rebel, because I went to see him speak and at a conference. And when he talked about cognitive diversity and the necessity of having that around the board, that really struck home to me, because that was something I thought, but I hadn't put it into the words that he had. So it was always in the back of my mind, because when he said that, you can have 6 Albert Einsteins around a table and they won't give you any more benefit than one would. So, if you mix it up and you have different people, that's a much more effective board. And that always struck with me. But having listened to Owen Gardner, I think it was, with The Belonging, and I downloaded the book, and I haven't read it, but I did listen to the podcast, that everything that he was saying just struck home to me. And that really is something that I think, when he was talking about belonging and, meeting your board members and being more effective, I think that was just really valuable for every board member to read.
Your favourite quote and why?
Okay, well, this was something that my mum used to say to us growing up, and it really annoyed us for a long time. But she used to say, if all of your friends jumped off a cliff, would you go after them? And we just couldn't understand it, because we were like, where is this coming from? But what she meant was, even from that young age, stay true to your culture and your values, because it's really easy to lose those as you go down the road. So for me, being a Muslim woman coming into this sector, I've carried my culture and my faith with me, and I won't compromise on that. And I think that's really useful. So that was really wise advice. We didn't always appreciate it, but we do now.
Your best ever holiday and why?
Oh, I went in 2010 to Lebanon and then to Syria when my sister was there. She was there for the UN because her husband was in the UN. And Lebanon is the most amazing space. And I went to visit the Jaita Grotto, which is a bit like Journey to the Centre of the Earth, if you've ever seen that. Just the most amazing natural space. And then following on from that, we went to the Bekaa Valley, which was the ruins of the man-made space, and just incredible. And then, of course, I was very lucky to be able to go through to Damascus before the war started. And I've always wanted to have that the road to Damascus moment, which I did. And then we went to Damascus, and it was absolutely beautiful. The people there were just so serene, so peaceful. There were generations of people who were following on from their parents' crafts. It was the most peaceful place. So, it devastates me now to see what's happened to it. But yeah, that was my most memorable holiday.
Your most significant professional insight?
So I was at a Labour conference years back, and Arnie Graf, I think he was the Obama organizer, he was in the room and he was speaking to some people about change, organisation. And he said, if you can't change the people, change the people. And that was very profound to me.
And last but not least, your favourite podcast?
Okay, so honestly, I've only just discovered podcasts a few months ago, and that was through our very own Mr. Michael Spicer, Room Next Door. And I just loved it because he's so funny. And then I was asked to do some of them and I started listening more. But I have listened to quite a few of your podcasts and, I found them fascinating. I think they're really useful sources of information. And I think I'm getting more into the podcast. I've downloaded the app now. So I'm getting more into listening to podcasts because I think that's growing up reading. You read physical books, but you never think about listening to them. So I think this is a really good way of, listening to podcasts to get the information that you may not have time to kind of sit down and read about.
Bushra, this has flown by. I really appreciate you taking the time. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for also just being so inspiring as well.
Thank you. I've loved doing it. So thank you for inviting me.